Hi, I'm Josh Rushing. Welcome to the stream. Now, it's been 20 years since the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, an event that ushered in decades of chaos, loss, instability. But even though the shadow of invasion remains, Iraqis continue to work to rebuild their country. Today, we ask, what is the legacy of the invasion on life in Iraq? But first, let's hear from a couple of young Iraqis who share their memories from 2003.
During the war in 2003, we lived through bombing, gunfire and explosions with fear and anxiety. We were not comfortable. The situation is now better, and we remember the days of the war, but we hope that they are gone for good.
There is an incident after the war that I'll never forget until this day. One of the neighbors who sells CDs and cassettes was killed by armed men. The killing happened in the street, and destruction was everywhere. I believe it was a result of the oppression and injustice by the former regime.
Joining us to discuss from Gaziantep activist and co-founder of IQ Peace, Nuf Assisi. In Providence, Rhode Island, professor and director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University, Nadia Al-Ali. And with us from Istanbul, journalist and author of A Stranger in Your Own City, Gaith Abdul Ahad. And of course, there's one more seat at this table, and that's you. If you're watching live on YouTube, see the box over there? We have a producer waiting to get your comments to me so I can get them to our guest. All right, Gaith, I'm gonna begin with you because I just recently read your article in The Guardian with reflections about the day that you realized US troops had arrived in Baghdad. Can you kind of walk me through that memory?
Well, I mean, I was in my house. I went to the balcony, to the rooftop, actually, and I saw these American helicopters. I realized they were American because they're small and nimble and very scary. And
yeah, you described them like an angry wasp, which I thought was an excellent description.
Because we're used to these kind of fat, kind of Russian M8, that swayed left and right. And a neighbor comes and knocks at the door and says, the Americans are here. And I say, yes, I heard on the World Service they're in Hella, 100 kilometers to the south. He says, no, they're here in the street. And I can't describe this feeling up until today, 20 years later. It's you're fed for decades on America being this invader. We've had already a war with America. We've been bombed by the Americans for like 2-3 weeks. In 91, we were bombed. And then you go down and you see American soldiers. They were Marines, actually. And it's a kind of a very weird, strange feeling. And I followed them, of course, that day. And I stood in the square and I watched the statue being toppled.
Can I ask you about that real quick? Because that's a very famous moment. And a number of people believe that was a staged moment because they said that the young men in the square didn't have Iraqi accents. They happened to have a flag that was pre-Saddam, ready to put up on the statue. You were there in the square that day. What was your impression of it?
So I live very close to that square. I mean, I live by the theater square, the National Theater, and I followed the Marine down the Saddam Street, and it just kind of happened to be that statue there, that kind of very badly cast statue. But also in front of the statue, there are these two famous hotels, the Sheraton and the Meridian, where all the international media were there. So I stood in the square. There were Marines. There were probably 200, 150 journalists, and much less a smaller crowd of Iraqis. So I stood there watching. It wasn't staged. And then the Iraqis tried to topple the statue. They had these big kind of hammers. They hammered at the plinth, just cracked some marbles. And then the Marine probably were so impatient that they drove back their vehicle, put the noose, pulled the statue. But before pulling, one of the Marines took out this American flag and put it on the face of the statue, this iconic image. And at the time, I thought, what are you doing? This is kind of like, this is really bad. You're destroying. Let the Iraqis at least celebrate this fiction of a liberation. But later, I came to realize that this Marine was much more honest than anyone else because he saw the war as a war between the United States and Iraq. He didn't believe in all this rhetoric of liberation and freedom and whatnot. So, I was there. It was not
It's
staged.
such a metaphor, though. It's such a metaphor for the the success of the invasion, for knocking out Saddam, which a lot of people, I think, had hope for, and then for immediately screwing it up in the name of this kind of... Go ahead.
Look, I don't think that acts screw up anything. I don't think that pulling a flag screwed up the whole fiction. I don't think Bremer's mishandling screwed up things. I don't think the fact that the Americans came to Iraq so criminally negligent of what was happening screwed up everything. It was bound to fail. It was bound to have an American occupation of a Middle Eastern country after 100 years of all that's been happening in the Middle East. It was bound to fail. There was no, I mean, it could have failed less dramatically, maybe without an extreme civil war, without the jihadis flooding into Iraq, maybe. But the idea of invading a country, then establishing a democracy, not any country, a country that you've bombed in 91, put under severe sanctions for 13 years, and then again bombed in 2003, and come and become a democracy. It was bound to fail.
Bound to fail. Okay, full disclosure, a lot of our audience knows this on Al Jazeera, but I was a Marine at the time. I was stationed in Doha at U.S. Central Command headquarters when that statue went down. I'm going to follow that with another apology. Noof, I think I added a syllable to your name in the introduction. I have no idea why I did that, but I want to say your name correctly because you deserve it. Noof Asi? Is that the way to pronounce the last name? I apologize for that. Dude, what are your memories? I mean, you were quite young at the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, like at that time I was like a scared teenager, a 13-year-old who's like, has no idea what's going on except like the idea of like, that like one thing that was like in my memory that like my parents, my family, they have a memory of like a couple of wars, and that's my first. So I was like trying like to do that comparison between like what is the difference between like my elder sister's like memory of like the other like 2 wars and mine. What's gonna happen? Didn't think much of like what's gonna happen after, or like how it's gonna because like, to be honest, like what I was like thinking of is like, oh, Saddam, he's like gonna win, and then it's like we're gonna have another like day off at school, because that's what we are like used to, right? Never like thought like that. Like this whole experience will change the way I look at life, or like the way that we all, at least like my generations, how we're like now becoming like different into the way of thinking, the way of making decisions and so on.
Well, dig in on that. How did it change the way you look at life?
Let's say is that like I was a dreamer who wanted like to be an artist, and then I studied like fine arts, but then I realized that like all I know is emergency response, so that driven my career at the moment, because I'm better at it. I'm better at like doing responding to emergencies because I experienced it. I know how people feel. I know how people are afraid, and that's like shifted my whole life, gave me another like perspective into what are like the priorities like for me, especially is like not only for me is that like the war itself, it is something, but then it's like the aftermath of the war that's like really shaped us. That turned us into is like considering like life and death. I still remember it's like at some parts of my life, I lost like my humanity. I couldn't like care for others who are like dying because people are like getting killed in the streets. And we're like hoping like, to get like that like warm like death is like in bed.
Wait, no. How do you go from being denured to death because you're around it all the time to now you're actually in Gaziantep to help with the earthquake and emergency response? Like, what a transition there.
The transition is that like, as I mentioned, is that like I'm a person who was like experienced war, experienced conflicts and violence. And then at one point I was a refugee at one time, and at one time I was an IDP. So I know like how people feel. So which make me like know better how like what is like the immediate response for them. So that's why it's like that's like how it's shifted. It's like now it's like I know it's like I really understand like people in Turkey when they, and also it's like in Syria, they like over a sudden like they lost their houses and they're like lost everything and barely like alive. I totally get that feeling because I experienced it. So that make me think about like what are like the priorities like to prepare in terms of like how we design a response as a humanitarians.
It's a weird thought, I think, to think something so terrible as this war actually created this kind of loving, compassionate thing that you're doing now for people who are suffering from a disaster. That's quite an arc. Nadia, I want to bring you in. As the 20th anniversary of this invasion has, come upon us, what have you been reflecting on? What have you been thinking about?
Well, I mean, on one level, I was remembering the time when I was part of the Iraqi diaspora. So I have a slightly different perspective because I wasn't inside Iraq. I was in London during the time of the invasion. And as many Iraqis, I mean, Iraq since the 50s has really experienced several waves of migration and displacement. So there's a very large Iraqi diaspora. And interestingly, the diaspora was quite divided over the question of the invasion. So there were actually some people in the Iraqi diaspora who were pushing for it. I was not part of that. I was part of the protest movement against sanctions and invasion. And I had, together with some friends, started Act Together Women's Action for Iraq. And I remember seeing the pictures, being part of a protest and feeling some sense of, hope and collective mobilization, not just in London, but globally. And I have to say that until the very end, I couldn't believe that it was actually going to happen. The day of the invasion, Act Together started an exhibition in London called Our Lives in Pieces. We had asked Iraqis to provide us with some artifact or some piece that symbolized their relationship to Iraq. And the day that we opened the exhibition, the invasion happened. And I remember all of us just couldn't believe it. And of course, I'm thinking about my family. I have some family members who lost their lives. And for me, yes, academically, since the invasion, I've been trying to really document the huge gap between the very rhetoric of liberation and reality. And my focus has been to show that women actually have been the largest victims of the invasion and occupation, because not only have we seen the proliferation of violence and militia, lawlessness, chaos, but we've seen an incredible increase in gender-based violence and a much greater shift towards social conservatism. So, Rais has documented the increase in the militia, whether Sunni or Shia. When they would move into a neighborhood, the first thing they would do would target women, would force them to wear a certain dress code, would control their movement, would control who they would be seeing. So, but I think it's also important to not portray Iraqi women as mere victims of the invasion and occupation, because we also saw that after 2003, there was a mushrooming of women's rights organization. And, women really try to push against the US-led occupations policy. I mean, some people, when I go and give talks in the US, people said, but, the occupation gave women the quota, so a certain percentage, 25% of all representation is women. But that's despite US objection. This is Iraqi women's rights activists pushing and pushing until they would get this. So the first thing that dropped off the agenda of the US-led occupation was women's rights and any kind of commitment to gender-based equality.
Yeah, I'm struck by your position before, because you were saying, yes, we're against the war, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge Saddam actually is a really negative force in Iraq.
Yes. So, I was not happy, or many of us were not happy with some of the US-based or UK-based anti-sanctions and anti-war activism, because I think they were very much focusing on, imperialism, anti-Western policies, but they were glossing over the atrocities of the regime of Saddam Hussein. And for myself and many of my friends, it was really, really important to do both, to say, well, Saddam Hussein is a dictator. He has been involved in terrible atrocities and human rights abuses, but that does not justify an invasion and occupation.
Mm. I want to bring in another voice. This is from our community. This is from Al-Sadi. Check this out.
I have a double feelings about the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. One of the side that's Iraq is more open to the world than in the time compared with Saddam Hussein. On the other side, many bad things have happening since then. Many Iraqis have been killed, and there is a lot of hate speech and extremism now.
Yeah, so, you know, as a young Marine, I believe what I was told when we were I was selling the war in the media basically as this liberation. That's not the way it turned out at all. That's not the way it turned out. It turned out with what he was saying, mixed results, I would say a whole lot of chaos. Gaith, can you kind of bring us up, like 20 years later, what do we have now in Baghdad?
I mean, I totally agree with Nadia. I mean, this whole binary, I mean, up until now, 20 years later, people ask me, so what was better, Saddam or the occupation? As if Iraqis deserve nothing, either a mad dictator or an illegal occupation. I mean, Iraqis deserve something else in between. 20 years on, where are we now? We are, you know, apart from all the disasters that happened with the war, apart from all the atrocities that committed after, what the war enshrined in Iraq, enshrined a political system. Although democratic on paper, it's based on sectarian ethnic quota, what we call in Arabic al-muhasasa. And that muhasasa system ensures that there is this division of spoils, the division of state resources, and you end up with one of the most corrupt governments or countries in the world. Iraq today is $100 billion a year budget, kind of oil money. And yet some parts of Iraq, some parts of Baghdad itself is on par with some of the worst countries in the world in terms of poverty. It sits in the bottom of everything, to the bottom of Transparency International, UNDP, you call it. So where is Iraq now? Iraq is a mutant state. It is democratic in terms of constitution, but it has a penal code that goes back to the Ba'athist regime of 1968. The kind of the freedom which was the only thing that was good outcome of this war, a kind of a freedom of expression, art, creativity, writing, whatever you want to call it, that is being eroded as we speak now. And the other thing, which is kind of very, very important, personally, I think, is the state of Iraq is this kind of very weird mutant state. It's not yet defined. 20 years later, it's still trying to define its trajectory, its national rhetoric, and all these things.
So I'm getting notes from our producers that says a lot of people.
Here?
Yeah, Nadia,
Sorry,
I just want to say something to YouTube, and then I'm going to come to you. It says a lot of people on YouTube are sharing their memories of where they were when the Iraq War started. This is an American that says that she felt helpless, hated Bush, and the guy who threw the shoe at him was a hero. That's Catherine. We have a lot of, there's some Iraqis in there sharing memories as well. So just what I want to say to our YouTube community is, I love it. Keep sharing memories. Keep talking about this. In the meantime, Nadia, yes, please jump in.
Yeah, I just feel that it's really important, given that it's 20 years, to also stress that, I mean, I personally feel uncomfortable to not mention that it's not only the US-led invasion. When I say US-led, of course, there were other international military troops involved, particularly the UK. But I think we also need to stress the responsibility of corrupt, sectarian Iraqi politicians. And yes, it is true that the US-led invasion facilitated them getting into power. But Iraqis are not just puppets. I mean, many of them were advocates of the invasion. Many of them were complicit. Many of them since then have been, as Reis very much pointed out, have been incredibly corrupt, have been authoritarian. I mean, we have come full circle, again, in terms of political repression. And of course, we also need to think about regional factors. I mean, there's Iran, there's Saudi Arabia, there's Qatar. I don't think we can live also in this sort of world where we can reduce everything to the US invasion. This is not at all to diminish the responsibility and the effects, but there are many, many actors and many factors that have led to the situation that we find ourselves in today. But also picking up on what Reis was saying, the new generation is really trying to resist. And I have hope because the new generation has been out on the street. It's protesting. It is very much opposed to sectarianism. It is using not just traditional forms of politics, but also creativity, culture, film, to express their dissent and also to express their vision for the future. And they just want to live. They want to live, quote unquote, normal lives.
You know, it's so interesting because I'm hearing a thread here, Gaith. You just mentioned it about a kind of loss of the arts. Nadia, you just said that the younger generation might be engaging with the arts again. And then I see Noof over there who dreamed of being an artist but spends her life responding to disasters. Has Iraq found its identity, the post-war, that isn't defined by the war yet, Noof?
I think it's like we are still like, let's say, it's like looking at like the past 20 years. We have been like in different like struggles. We have been like into different like, let's say, people like trying like different ways. Like I at one point, like, to be honest, like I lost hope that like we will have like, let's say, like a generation that is really born like to the country and knows like considers like what we need as Iraqis, not like what is like my sect or like my background or like where like I'm belongings like want, including militias, parties, political parties, and so on. All these like considered. Until October. October like did that change. Did something like really important. Like after like if we look at after the sectarian war like in Iraq have been divided into silos like based on sects background. So it's like I'm from Baghdad. Baghdad have been like siloed as neighborhoods, which like led into like generations that like were not really mixed among each other. That mix that like maybe is like the different like the older like generations that have been living like together is like we didn't feel that, and the generations like comes after me. October or like Tishreen, how I love to call it, Tishreen broke like that. Tishreen mixed like everybody together. I have been like in Tahrir squares, like we were like all together and people were like talking about like, I'm from like this area. And it's like, we're like all together, even though it's like we're in different backgrounds. I had a tuk-tuk driver who was like telling me that like, I was like, I'm really glad now that like I have friends who are like, one of them is a doctor, one of them is an artist, and one of them is a singer and a musician.
They're
I
the
never
arts.
thought like I will be sitting like together like in one group.
I've only got about a minute left, but I know Iraq is reconsidering its constitution right now. Does anyone have hope that a new constitution might offer a new hope for Iraq's future? Real quick, Gaith?
So I totally agree with Noof. There is a moment of happiness, that a moment of trans-sectarian, post-sectarian politics that took place, and that was Tishreen 2019, 2020. This is a new generation, a post-Civil War generation. Now, one of the biggest casualties of the war is democracy itself. Because for the new generation, when you tell them parliament, they think corruption. When you tell them elections, they think people selling their votes or buying votes. So that is a victim. So talking about changing the constitution is also a very double-sided sword, because people are so fed up with this idea of democracy that they call for bringing back a strong.
Gaith, I've got to stop you because we've got about half a minute left. I just want to thank all three of you for being on the program today. I want to remind our viewers the actual anniversary of the invasion is March 20th. Al Jazeera English will cover it all day, so come check back in here for that. And we'll see you next time on the stream.